Well, kids, let's get back to the events leading to the American Revolution. So, this week we've been talking about the 1760s and all of those laws that were passed, whether we're talking about the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, or things like the writs of assistance, which would be like a blank search warrant that could be used anytime by the Redcoats to search for smuggled goods or illegal things inside the colonist homes, and they couldn't do anything about it. So that brings us to 1770. The colonists are on edge. A city like Boston, for example, is extremely on edge just because of all the people that live there, and many of them are angry and they are looking for a way to resist the British. There are people in the city of Boston, like Samuel Adams and others, who will lead kind of this resistance to the British policies. They think it's tyranny. They think the king and parliament have gone too far. Of course, the king and parliament see what they're doing is perfectly legitimate and needed. They needed money. They were protecting the colonists, and they were looking out for the colonists' best interest. The colonists would whine about no taxation without representation. Of course, the king would say, most people living in the English world, that is the empire, the kingdom, would not be represented in parliament. You had to own land and you had to be of a certain status to be a part of parliament, to have a say, to vote. And people living in the colonies and many parts of England were not really represented. And even if they were represented, they would be extremely outvoted. They would never be able to get the things passed that they wanted. But the colonists felt that they needed a voice in their government, and that was important to them. The king was certainly not a tyrant, but the colonists saw him as one and were pushing to resist all of the things that the king and parliament were imposing upon them, whether it's taxes or putting soldiers in their homes, all of which we can understand why the colonists were upset. The king, however, didn't see it that way. So I hope you begin to see, as we've talked about this week, there's always two sides to every issue, and the colonists were seeing things from their perspective only, and the king was seeing things from his perspective. Boston is the real hotbed of all of this resistance by the time we get to the year 1770. So we're going to talk a little about what happens in 1770 and how that shapes the course of American history. So all of these feelings of tension and resentment are going on in Boston, and that brings us to this key event in early March of 1770, known as the Boston Massacre. Now, it may be called the Boston Massacre. It's up to you to decide whether or not you think it is truly a massacre. That's what the colonial leaders would call it. Men like Paul Revere, he'd refer to it as a massacre. But you can decide. So it goes like this. There's basically, lots of protests going on throughout Boston. It's late winter. It's still freezing cold. There are people outside protesting. The soldiers are there to try to keep order. The reason I bring up the whole idea of it's cold is because it matters. The protesters start throwing snowballs and ice at the government agents, the redcoats that are there, and having some clubs, like they actually have like bats and clubs. And so some of the redcoats are struck with ice and hit with clubs. And if you've ever been hit in the face when your face is cold with a snowball or an ice ball, it hurts. And if you got hit by a club, it really hurts. And so the redcoats are ordered not to fire on the crowd who are protesting, but something happens and they do fire, probably because they're scared, they're injured. Either way, they start firing into the crowd. It's certainly an unfair fight, as the redcoats have muskets, but it's not as if the crowd was unarmed. They had clubs, and they were picking a fight with the British, really. It was probably not the smartest move, and 5 colonists are actually shot and killed. One of them being an African American named Crispus Attucks would die instantly. 4 others would be killed as well, which is kind of ironic. One of the first people to die, really, in this cause for freedom would be someone, who would never really, if he had lived, have had true freedom. So this is kind of an event that stirs Boston, as you can imagine, and it's put out in the papers by Paul Revere and sent throughout the colonies as a way to show that the British redcoats are firing on their own people, that they're hostile and they're dangerous, and that the British government is now cracking down and killing its own citizens. In reality, what probably happened is these soldiers were scared and accidentally fired, and there would be a trial, and these soldiers would be punished somewhat, sent back to England. Some of them would actually have their hands branded, so big hot metal iron stuck on their hands near their thumb, so that they would be scarred, and for the rest of their life they would be reminded of what they did. It wasn't as if the British didn't take this seriously. They did. They had a trial, and it was determined that it was just a very tense situation, and while the British might have acted improperly, there was some cause for what they did. Nobody was really innocent in this event. However, this event is going to be taken by colonial leaders like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams as a way to push the colonists even closer to revolt against the king. Obviously, 5 Americans were killed. And this image you see on your screen of the British open firing into a crowd, an unarmed crowd, is one person's view of it. There's probably more to this story, as we know from just basic court records and the testimony of the British redcoats in their trial. So it serves to kind of push us closer to revolting, and it makes the American cause even stronger against resisting British rule. Just as kind of a side note, this kind of thing happens again from time to time in American history. In 1970, so 200 years later, college students are protesting the Vietnam War at a university in Ohio called Kent State University, and the Ohio National Guard would shoot into the crowd, killing protesters. And I'll be putting some stuff in the folder this week so you can kind of compare and think about, we'll do a little bit of this in class as well, the Boston Massacre and how that affected the colonies and what happened in Ohio in 1970 at Kent State. So maybe you could even ask your parents about Kent State. They might have some understanding about it. Most of your parents were probably young if they're even born yet, but your grandparents would certainly have some memories of what happened at Kent State in 1970. But again, protesters being fired on, and there's always 2 sides to every story, so we'll explore that a little bit. So that happens in 1770, and it just gets worse. By the time we get to 1773, there's a law by Parliament that would basically, in effect, change the way tea was being sold in America. Now, the actual price of tea went down, but the colonists had to buy from only one type of company called the East India Tea Company. So this is kind of a complicated issue, but in the end, the colonists don't like being told what to do. They don't like being forced to buy tea from a certain company. Even though the actual price of it went down, they're just not in the mood to be told what to do by the British king and by Parliament when they feel they have no say in it. So again, another thing where the king is doing something he thinks is going to help the colonists, but the colonists see it a certain way. They see it in a negative way. And of course, you remember from elementary school, this is going to lead to what's known as the Boston Tea Party, where some of these radicals like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere and others will lead a kind of a protest where they destroy the tea. They dump it into the harbor in the middle of winter, right? In 1773, December. The Sons of Liberty, this radical group of colonial resistance leaders, will go and board a ship and throw the tea overboard. They're mad about the taxes and the little choice they have in their government. And so, under the cover of darkness, they dress like Indians, and no one really thought they were Indians, but it was just a way to kind of divert from what their true identity, and they dump the tea in the harbor. Now, of course, how would the British see this? The king, he's going to see it as destruction of property, vandalism, and they're not going to take kindly to this kind of destruction of property and resistance. So, the next year, remember this is December, that's the end of 1773, and right away, the king and Parliament pass what's known as the Intolerable Acts, meaning what you've done, we just can't tolerate. Boston, you're getting out of control, and so we will now punish you for what you've done and reassert our control over these colonies. You're getting a little radical up in Boston. You need to know that we're still the boss of you. So Parliament, King George III, issues the Intolerable Acts, written in England, of course, but affects Boston. It's just a piece of paper, but it's a series of laws that will close Boston Harbor, meaning no more ships in or out of Boston. You're on lockdown. Your government is now, you can't have a local government anymore. We're sending more and more redcoats over to control this radical city. We're going to lock you down. You're effectively grounded. So Boston is busted. They are in trouble with the king. And this is the kind of stuff that Paul Revere, Sam Adams, and others are going to just be resisting and pushing for more and more kind of, I don't want to say rebellion yet, but it's coming. And there will be fighting soon. While all that is happening in Boston, okay, so we got two locations really. We got Boston, where this stuff is happening. We've also got things happening down in Philadelphia. So the Congress, this is the first time we're going to use this word. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia stays home, but all of the other colonies send representatives to Philadelphia, right? Philadelphia is right in the middle of the 13 colonies. They send representatives to start to work this thing out. Like, what should we do? Like, is it getting too crazy? They send men like John Adams from Massachusetts, and George Washington will come from Virginia, Patrick Henry. A lot of other people will come to this meeting in 1774. Now, a Congress is like a long meeting, right? So it's not meeting constantly, but they meet during the day, they go home or to a hotel at night, they come back the next day. It's kind of a meeting that goes on throughout the day. And this happens in September and October of 1774 in Philadelphia. Not a lot is done because they're not quite sure what to do. But they do decide to ban trade with Britain and to start training the local troops, like the militia, start getting them ready, because who knows how this could go. They know that they're kind of busted for dumping the tea, and that Boston is in lockdown, and more troops are coming, and it doesn't look good. There's not a lot that comes out of the First Continental Congress other than to show you that the colonies are willing to meet and start thinking about what they should do to resist the British rule. The fact that it's called a First Continental Congress tells us that there will be a Second Continental Congress, and that's where a lot more of the important things will happen. So, just to be clear, there's two locations now as we head into the 1770s. We have Boston and we have Philadelphia. Boston is where we have the massacre, the Tea Party, and up near there we'll have our first shots of the war at Lexington and Concord, which we'll talk about soon. That's in April of 1775. So Boston is where the action is in terms of fighting and resisting. Philadelphia is where the meetings will take place. The First and Second Continental Congresses will take place in Philadelphia. That will be the place of the meetings. So we got Boston, where the action is, Philadelphia, where the politics take place. And finally, just to give you an idea of what's happening through the 1760s and early 1770s, we've got the Proclamation of 1763, all of those laws we talked about in class, and we're going to wrap up today with the 1774 year, the First Continental Congress. All of this is just, the colonies are on edge, and we're about ready to go to war.